I now give the floor to Ms. Hanna Serwaa Tetteh.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of Council. 4 months have elapsed since I first presented the roadmap to this Council on the 21st of August, and UNSMIL has been engaging Libyan stakeholders with regard to its implementation, which I admit has been quite challenging. During my last briefing, I reported that the prioritized first actions for the implementation of the roadmap, namely the reconstitution of the board of the High National Elections Commission, HNEC, and the consideration and passage of the amendments to the constitutional and legal framework for elections that were recommended by the advisory committee set up earlier this year by UNSMIL, have not yet been achieved. But this is not for lack of trying and engagement with the two chambers. In my last briefing, I had informed that the two committees on sovereign positions of the House of Representatives and the High State Council, respectively, had agreed on the 4th of October to reconstitute the HNEC within 2 weeks. Despite multiple efforts and engagements with these institutions, this did not happen. While the High State Council provided names to the House of Representatives for selection of a chair of HNEC, there was no further progress. UNSMIL subsequently convened on the 20th of November a plenary meeting of the International Follow-up Committee on Libya at the ambassadorial level, with the participation of representatives of the two institutions, and invited them to brief on their progress on these 2 milestones. But it was clear that there was still a lot of work to be done to arrive at a consensus. On 28 November, after further engagement, the two institutional committees of the respective bodies, in the presence of UNSMIL, signed an agreement establishing a mechanism for the selection of the board members of HNEC. According to the agreed timelines, names of candidates should have been transferred by the High State Council to the House of Representatives and selection finalized by the 11th of December. However, this did not happen. It is our assessment that the delays are a manifestation of the lack of trust between the two institutions, their own internal divisions, and the inability to overcome their differences and agree on the way forward to resolve the current impasse. But I must acknowledge, however, the serious efforts by some members of these institutions to advance these two processes. Regarding the amendment of the constitutional and legal framework for elections, the High State Council had dissolved its delegation to the 6+6 committee in 2023 in an internally contested decision. And it was only on Wednesday, the 17th of December, that we received a communication from the presidency of the High State Council to the effect that they had reconstituted the High State Council delegation to the 6+6 committee, which now creates the opportunity to engage on these matters. We note that this has been an internally contested matter within the High State Council, with more than 75 members writing to UNSMIL expressing their support for the original 6+6 members to take this legislation forward. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, we believe that it is necessary to complete these two tasks in order to have credible elections. It would be desirable for HNEC to have a fully constituted board to manage the process of conducting what would be the most consequential elections in the history of the country. The board's legal framework requires that all regions of the country are represented on the board, and currently the East is not represented. We note, however, that the board has just enough members to have a quorum to facilitate the conduct of business, which is the reason why it has been possible to conduct municipal elections across the country. Therefore, we will continue our work with HNEC to facilitate the conduct of presidential and legislative elections. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, on the 28th of November, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Aguilar Saleh, released a statement calling for the holding of presidential elections following simultaneous demonstrations in 5 cities in the Eastern region demanding presidential elections. In response, HNEC released a statement on the 30th of November stating its readiness to begin preparations for presidential and legislative elections starting in April 2026. More recently, these calls for elections have been echoed by Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dibeiba in his 16th December statement. In the same statement, the Prime Minister announced his intention to conduct a government reshuffle of the Government of National Unity. We are not privy to the details of any intended reshuffle. UNSMIL calls on the main political actors to facilitate an agreement on the legal framework for elections so that HNEC can proceed with its necessary preparations. We will also advance a mechanism to address changes in the electoral laws. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, on the 14th and 15th of December, UNSMIL launched the inaugural meeting of the structured dialogue, which is one of the core components of the roadmap. This is the first process of this magnitude to be held on Libyan soil. UNSMIL invited nominations from key sovereign institutions, civil society actors, political parties, academia, and cultural and linguistic components, and also invited representation from other state institutions. The structured dialogue brings together a representative spectrum of Libyan society with 124 Libyan personalities representing these different institutions and stakeholder groups. While its launch took place in Tripoli, it is the intention of UNSMIL to facilitate meetings of the thematic working groups across the country and also encourage participation through digital platforms so that as many as possible have the opportunity to share their views on the matters under consideration. Libyan women comprise 35% of the participants, and we also ensure the representation of young people and persons with disabilities. We received over 1,000 solicited and unsolicited nominations, reflecting the desire of Libyans who are not in government to contribute to developing a unified vision for the future of their country. While some did not join due to political circumstances, we hope they will be able to join future meetings. The structured dialogue is intended to define guiding principles for state building and formulating policy and legislative recommendations in the area of governance, the economy, security, and national reconciliation. This approach is expected to help facilitate the creation of the political conditions for a peaceful electoral process to be held, and also help to maintain peace and stability in the aftermath of elections. It is also intended to solicit the views of Libyans themselves on addressing the critical challenges facing the country, as well as their views on the appropriate mechanisms and structures that should be developed for the implementation of the structured dialogue outcomes. The outcomes will be published for dissemination among the broader public. I would like to be clear that the structured dialogue will proceed in parallel with the other tracks of the roadmap and is not a replacement of any of the identified milestones of the roadmap. We will consult with members of the structured dialogue and consider their recommendations relating to the implementation of the first two steps of the roadmap, which will inform our proposals for a mechanism for progressing changes in the electoral laws. I am pleased to report the positive and constructive spirit by members in both the plenary session and the four thematic tracks of the structured dialogue. They also reflected on the responsibility they feel towards the Libyan people to address pressing issues facing the country that directly impacts their lives. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, Libya's persistent fiscal fragmentation continues to undermine economic stability in the Libyan dinar, weaken service delivery, and erode public trust in state institutions. Against this backdrop, on the 18th of November, delegates from the House of Representatives and the High State Council signed an agreement establishing a unified development program as a common framework for development spending. UNSMIL considers this a constructive step in the right direction, intended to strengthen financial stability through implementing expenditure controls and advancing development initiatives across the country in a financially prudent and inclusive manner. If implemented with transparency, effective oversight, and alignment with Libyan law and international public financial management standards, it could help address the core economic challenges, including strengthening the provision of public goods and services to the population. UNSMIL stands ready to support Libyan institutions in harmonizing and strengthening the country's fragmented oversight and regulatory architecture to enable coherent implementation of the agreement. The mission urges Libyan stakeholders to continue dialogue towards agreeing on a unified national budget. On the 18th of October, municipal council elections were successfully held in 16 municipalities following their interruption in August. Voter turnout was 68%. On the 13th of December, elections were conducted in 9 municipalities, including Benghazi, Sabha, and Sirte, where the processes had previously been suspended. As HNEC continues working towards the announcements of results, these elections are a welcome step in restoring the legitimacy of local governance. We commend the authorities in the East and South for securing the electoral process and hope that this will give a further stimulus for national elections. Madam President, Excellencies, following the agreement on new security arrangements in Tripoli, the security in the environment in the capital has stabilized to a certain extent. The truce continues to hold. However, the situation in the city and in Western Libya remains fragile, with sporadic outbreak of armed clashes in areas of southern Tripoli and elsewhere. I urge all relevant actors to work together towards implementing the security arrangements agreed upon and advance the necessary reforms to achieve stability. Through UNSMIL's facilitation, a joint border communication center was established on the 28th of October in Benghazi, complementing the center set up in Tripoli in April of this year. This is a constructive step in advancing a unified approach between the LNA and the GNU towards border management and cooperation. Madam President and Excellencies, members of Council, we welcome Libya's universal periodic review process that took place in the Human Rights Council on the 11th of November and stand ready to work closely with Libyan authorities and stakeholders on the recommendations that were made. Nonetheless, I remain deeply concerned about human rights violations, including violence against women, migrants, and minorities, and deaths in custody. The killing of Hansa al-Mujahed, a prominent figure and blogger, on the 21st of November in Tripoli, sends a chilling message to women on participating in public life and risks silencing them at a time when their contribution is most needed. I call on the authorities to expedite an impartial and transparent investigation, prosecute those responsible, and take urgent measures to ensure all Libyans can safely engage in civic activities without fear, which would include the adoption of the law on the prevention of violence against women. On the 26th of October, UNSMIL sadly confirmed another death in custody of a detainee in Benghazi, following allegations of torture and denial of medical care by a unit reportedly affiliated with the Minister of Interior in the East. This brings the total of 24 deaths in custody across the country that have been verified by UNSMIL between March and November this year. These deaths raise serious concerns about wider patterns of arbitrary detention, ill treatment, and lack of accountability. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, regarding the implementation of the decisions of this Council in respect of the extension of the mission's mandate in UN Security Council Resolution 2796 of this year, and taking into consideration the recommendations of the strategic review, UNSMIL has set up an internal task force to implement the decisions and recommendations, but in a gradual manner due to resource constraints. We have started with recommendations that can be implemented within existing resources to include, among other things, increasing the mission's presence in Eastern Libya and establishing a dedicated economic section in UNSMIL, which is planned for early 2026. UNSMIL also intends to expand its presence in Sabha in 2027, should resources allow, and will include this in its budget proposals for 2027 to be submitted early next year. Madam President, Excellencies, members of Council, the political process should not be held hostage by the inaction of key political stakeholders who, willingly or not, are maintaining the status quo. In my last briefing, I stated that if the two institutions fail to have agreed on the first two milestones of the political roadmap, I would be prepared to seek an alternative mechanism and seek the support of this Council. The launch of the structured dialogue gives us the opportunity to also consult Libyan interlocutors on the most effective way of proceeding on the first two elements of the roadmap. And we will draw on their recommendations to advance the creation of the political conditions needed for the holding of elections. In parallel, we will continue to engage with key political stakeholders also to advance the political roadmap. I intend to present this mechanism in my upcoming briefing in February. In a few days, Libyans will celebrate Independence Day on the 24th of December, the same date that was set for national elections in 2021. 4 years later, the country's path to election remains fraught with complications that are challenging, but we believe can be overcome. I call on all Libyan leaders to respond to the desires of the Libyan people and rise above their differences in the interests of the unity and integrity of the Libyan state, and to advance the welfare of the Libyan people. The true spirit of independence lies in a nation's ability to shape its destiny through unity, paving the way for a secure sovereign state with a government that enjoys the support of the majority of its citizens, renewed legitimacy, and unified institutions. That is what we are working towards. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Tetteh for her briefing.